Kitty-O Go presents The Power of Persuasion with Dr. Milan Lebray. Every day we see the power of persuasion and the impact social proof has on us. In fact, these implications can be so powerful that they can create positive changes or mob mentality. It can change your thinking as an individual or a collective. Why? Because many of us are driven by the assumption that the people around us must possess more knowledge about a situation regardless of whether or not the information is correct. Essentially, we can fall into a pattern of conformity when we are unsure of the correct way to behave or think. So we may look to the external world for cues on how to proceed in this temporary or long-term state of confusion. The information we receive can lead to public compliance or personal acceptance. As you can imagine, this can also take a dangerous turn if you have a large gathering of people, as it may play out as a riot or insurrection. However, marketing experts and social media influencers know about the power of persuasion and social proof, and they use these principles to their advantage. How? Well, there are basic assumptions that the consumer will adapt their behavior to align with what the other people are doing. Here's an example. TikTok beauty influencer uses, rates, and recommends a new type of mascara. Next thing you know, it's sold out. In addition to being influenced by social proof, there are other ways that the powers of persuasion control us. One such way is something called bystander effect. What is it? Have you ever seen a stranger in need of help? Did you help or not? And if you did, what persuaded you to do that? If not, why not? The fact of the matter is that whether or not we respond is based primarily on whether or not we are alone or in a group. And as it turns out, the greater the number of people around us, in other words, bystanders, the less likely it is for us to help someone in distress. In fact, research shows that we tend to help people when we're alone or very few people are around to witness our behavior. The bystander theory came into play in 1964 in response to the murder of Kitty Genovese. Kitty was stabbed outside her apartment. A staggering 38 people claimed to witness the attack, but none of them called the police or even came to her aid. However, before we judge, our decision-making process isn't as simple as just helping out or not. There are quite a few variables that come into play regarding our desire to step in potentially. First, we tend to determine if the situation is dangerous. Then we assess the degree of responsibility, the form of assistance required, and whether or not we will implement an action based on the cost of the intervention, meaning if there's a physical or non-physical component. After we've processed all that information, we decide whether or not to help someone based on race, gender, and even the types of clothes they may be wearing. Who knew that helping could be so complicated? But in the end, the sad fact is that most of us are actually less inclined to help rather than more inclined. Apart from social proof, I'm sure you are wondering what other powers of persuasion dictate how the majority of us behave on a day-to-day basis. Well, essentially, some of our behaviors come down to the desire to be accepted. At some point, we've all had the experience of wanting to fit in, be liked, or accepted into a group. We call this normative influence. It is a form of conformity based on one's desire to fulfill someone's expectations and gain acceptance. There are also times where we want to be accepted for our views but lack the knowledge about an issue. So we look to a group for information or direction. This is referred to as informational influence. Have you ever found yourself adopting a particular habit, behavior, or belief to fit in? Maybe you stopped eating gluten or started a fad diet because a social media influencer was doing it. If so, that is a form of identification where we want to fit into a particular social role and do so by observing others and taking on their behaviors just to fit in. As you can imagine, this has the potential to go horribly wrong. I have 3 words: Tide Pod Challenge. The point of conformity is about changing our beliefs or behavior to be accepted by the group or the collective. Our intense need to fit in can be in response to an internal or external stimulus, such as the belief about a perceived pressure we think we have, or in response to someone or something. So let's look at 4 types of conformity. They are compliance. We go along with a request or demand even if we don't want to, because we want to attain a positive reaction from a group or person. A simple example, you're told to go outside, so you just do it. Internalization. It's both an outward and inward behavior where a person adopts the viewpoints and attitudes of a group and makes them their own. This is actually the deepest form of conformity. This example would be, you are influenced by a religious sect to convert to their faith. These new religious views continue as a way of life even without the presence of the group. Identification. This happens when a person changes their opinion or behavior, but usually only when in the presence of a person or the group. So for an example, a person decides to eat vegan food because her new roommate is vegan. Ingratiational. This is when someone agrees with the group even when their private views aren't the same, to gain acceptance or gain some kind of favor from others. An example of this is if a waiter asks you how your meal was, or if a colleague inquires about what you think of her new hairdo, you may probably say something nice, even if you don't entirely mean it. The power of influence is mighty powerful and sometimes out of our control, because our brains can go into autopilot and automatically respond to certain stimuli. For example, have you ever catastrophized an imaginary situation? Have you ever had an image or song pop into your head based on a smell, sound, or some visual? Have you ever seen a Starbucks logo and thought, some coffee would be nice? When this happens, it's called automatic response, and it's something that occurs on its own. You react, and more often than not, you are unaware of why you've decided, because the information comes from deep within. Your response can be triggered by anything from an image, action, or event. But regardless of why you respond, the reason is that the information is deeply embedded and causes us to automatically react or think in a certain way. There are specific ways that the brain processes information to help us make those choices. This is done with something called heuristics and systematic processing. These work to help us scrutinize and compare information before making a decision. Heuristic processing is when we are persuaded by cues in the message or situation. However, this is often done automatically. It typically happens when we lack the motivation or ability to process something deeply. Essentially, it's a mental shortcut that helps us make decisions and solve problems quickly. For example, many of us have done some kind of online shopping, but before we found a site that we liked more than another, we had to go through specific steps to recognize and decide whether or not it was trustworthy. We looked at the layout, return policies, graphics, ads, pricing, and even the ease of use. Then we stored this information for the next time we wanted to make a purchase. Due to our previous learning and experience, our processing period didn't require as much mental effort the second time we used the site. But heuristics as a concept is a bit more complicated, and there are several types of heuristics, so let's briefly look at those. The first is availability. This is information that comes to mind quickly and easily when making decisions. It can often be based on emotional impact rather than actual probability. Then there is simulation heuristics that focuses on what occurs after a person has experienced an event in their life. According to simulation heuristics, a person may imagine possible alternative outcomes to an event they've already encountered. Representative heuristics is when people evaluate the probabilities of an event by comparing it to an existing prototype that already exists in their mind. This is a little complicated, so let me explain it with an example. Police officers looking for a suspect in a crime might focus disproportionately on Black people in their search because the representativeness heuristics and the stereotypes they believe cause them to assume that Black people are more likely to be criminals than somebody from another group. Anchoring and adjustment is a person's tendency to accept and rely on the first piece of information received before deciding. And finally, framing is based on the old saying, it's not what you say, but how you say it. Framing is when we are influenced by how the same fact or question is presented to us. For example, you have two different yogurt containers. One says 1% fat. The other says 99% fat-free. Which one are you more likely to buy, even though they're precisely the same? So the long of the short here is that there is a lot to consider when we talk about the powers of persuasion. And as you are learning, we can be deeply impacted by these powers because more often than not, we aren't always consciously aware of what we're doing or how outside influences are manipulating us. But you can arm yourself with the knowledge to be a more conscious co-conspirator in life. But if you think that that's all there is to these powerful social constructs, you'd be wrong. This is just the beginning of our journey together to learn about how the power of persuasion drives us. Let's review. The power of persuasion can change thinking for an individual or the collective. Conformity takes place when we are unsure how to act or feel confused. It's about changing our beliefs and behaviors to be accepted by the collective. To do this, we use the principles of social proof to find cues from the external world on how to proceed. Bystander effects suggest that the greater number of people present, the less likely people are to help someone in distress. There are 4 types of conformity: compliance, internalization, identification, and ingratiational. Automatic response is when our brains go into a type of autopilot mode and we automatically respond to a certain stimuli. Heuristics are mental shortcuts we use to make decisions more quickly and efficiently. There are several types of heuristics: availability, simulation, representative, anchoring and adjustment, framing. Thanks for watching. Be sure to join all our super smart viewers on the next episode of Genius Insight.